Report a shot fired at officers trying to stop the vehicle.
We have one officer shot.
We got shots fired. Sounded like an automatic firearm.
Copy, code red, shots fired.
We have an active shooter. We have an active shooter inside the warehouse.
Now it's Shots Fired with your hosts TJ Kirgin, Dinah Death Milberg, and the lovely Krystal Powers.
Yeah, well, it's supposed to be TJ Kirgin and Krystal, but she's not here yet, so hopefully she's all right. She's typically here on Thursdays, so hopefully at some point during the show she'll come in. But I just got back from a war zone. I know that a lot of people use that terminology when describing things like storms and whatnot, but this absolutely was reminiscent of a war zone. I have been in South Florida for the last 10, well, maybe 11 or 12 days. Originally, I went down there to prep for the hurricane, to get ready for the disaster, which ironically is what this show is about, is being ready, right? Getting ready, preparing to preserve yourself. I'm going to get into something that happened to me today that is really, really crappy towards the end of the show. But right now I want to talk about, we went down to prep this for the storm. So Ian wasn't even a tropical storm yet. It was just it was a tickle in the Caribbean, and yet all the meteorologists were calling for it to ramp up, get very powerful, and head right for Tampa, right? So TacticalSht.T has a store in Tampa, St. Pete, Clearwater. It's on 49th Street in Largo, actually, which is right in the heart of the Tampa Bay area. And I've also got a couple homes there that I rent out as Airbnbs and that I live in when I'm there, which is roughly 51% of the time. And so I needed to get my homes ready for the hurricane. I needed to get my car ready, my boat ready, and all that stuff. And so I flew down with my wife, and we had a good, solid 3 or 4 days of preparation. During that time, the forecast continued to get worse and worse and worse and more, doomsday-ish, talking about 8 foot of storm surge and, a very slow moving storm with 130 mile an hour winds hitting the, originally they had called for it to come in just north of us, up over Anclote Island and go into, what was Tarpon Springs, or what is Tarpon Springs. And that would be a worst case scenario for us because, if you know anything about hurricanes, being south of the landfall is a very bad thing. Being north of the landfall is not as bad. And that has to do with the way they rotate. Storms on this side of the world, they rotate in a counterclockwise fashion. And so, if you imagine counterclockwise, if you're on the north side of it, the wind is going away from you. The water is being sucked away from you. And it's going around the vortex and getting slammed back into the south coast, south of the storm. That's where they get all the water and all the wind. You still get wind, don't get me wrong. It's just typically coming from the north or the northeast when you are on the north end of the storm. And northeast wind, meaning on the west side of Florida, that means the wind's coming offshore. It's blowing the waves down. It's coming from land, not from the Gulf or from the ocean. And so we went down there and we started doing all the things that we'd been told to do. We bought a ton of non-perishable food, stocked up on water. I really want to talk about the things that I've learned about surviving Armageddon by actually surviving Armageddon for the last couple of weeks, last week. It's amazing what I've learned to make my next hurricane or my next bad social situation, bad community situation better for me and my family. So we stocked up on water, and we stocked up on, things that we needed as far as food, stocked up on ice because we knew that there was going to be a power outage. We brought with us flashlights. We brought with us lanterns. We purchased extra batteries and all of that. And we flew down there. And when we got down there, that's when we picked up the water, although water was starting to get hard to find. But a few days before the storm, we could still find water. You could still find ice. When we got within about 48 hours of the storm, there was no water, plastic water, bottled water, whatever, anywhere to be found. There was no ice anywhere to be found. There was no batteries anywhere to be found. There was no gas cans anywhere to be found. These are the things that I learned. And so we got down there, and the first thing that they were saying is that we were going to get 8 feet of storm surge. So we went to the community center on the island that we have a home on, and we helped our neighbors and packed sandbags all day. So we filled 40 sandbags for my house, which really isn't that much. It allowed me to put 2 sandbags tall on each of my doors and windows. Not windows, my sliders, garage door, things like that. Which my house, believe it or not, actually sits in one of the highest land positions, which is also important to know. If you have a home on the coast and you need to know how high is my home's foundation from sea level at high tide, right? Because if a storm comes in on high tide with 5 foot of surge and tide is 3 feet, you're going to have 8 feet over regular tide. All right, so you need to know how high is your house over high tide. My house supposedly is about 6 to 7 feet over high tide. That's why we were starting to panic about 8 feet of storm surge. You know, I could always put on a new roof, but if we get 8 feet of storm surge, that's a foot of salt water in my house. That pretty much ruins everything. You know, all your furniture, your carpet, your tile, your drywall, your electrical, your HVAC units, your appliances, everything's ruined, right? A roof is easy to replace. The contents of the home, not so much. And will the home ever be the same if it gets a foot of salt water in it? You know, you're going to have mold issues. You're going to have all kinds of problems. So we were able to do the sandbags to, hopefully keep an extra foot or 6 or 8 inches of water out of the house should we get that 8 foot of storm surge. Then the next thing we did was we boarded up the house. But of course, when I went to board up the house, in Florida, you have shutters or you have plywood. And my house is a stucco house. And what that means, so what I had to secure the plywood to the house was I have these lag bolts sticking out around every window and every sliding door. And this house has been painted. There hasn't been a hurricane in years. These bolts haven't been used. And they're all steel bolts. So every single one of these bolts on the house, which I estimated we had 23 windows, call it 25 windows, and each one had 6 bolts minimum. So you're talking about, 150 bolts around the house. Every single one of them was rusted and painted over. So I had to literally get a drill bit with a wire brush and Dremel every single bolt on the house, WD-40 it, in order to get the threads so that we could actually thread on the wing nuts to put the drywall on the windows and the doors. So we did that. Of course, the drywall didn't fit all the windows and the doors because the last time there was a hurricane, some of the windows and doors have changed, so we had to cut some more, drill some more, and we finally got that all up and done. And so we had the house sandbagged, had our windows boarded up. Our boat is on a lift. We had the boat strapped down with 5,000-pound ratchet straps, 6 lines plus a chain, because if the boat, which is on the lift, which is 7.5 feet out of the water, so if you have 8 feet of surge plus wave action, the boat can come off the lift and actually go through the house. You see a lot of this after the storm down there. So we had to secure the boat to the lift and keep the boat from leaving the lift because the last thing you want to have happen is if you don't tie the boat up right, the water comes up, the boat floats half off the lift, the water goes down, the boat is half on the lift, now hanging in the water and then sinks. So we secured our boat as best as we could, and now it was time to wait. We were 24 hours out from the storm. That's the nice thing about these things. You get a lot of notice. 24 hours out from the storm, My wife and I, each night leading up to that, had partaken in quite a bit of liquor to enjoy our evenings after doing all that work. But the night of the storm, the night it was supposed to start coming in, we stayed completely sober because in a critical situation like that, you got to be sober. You got to have a plan. You got to be able to execute your plan. Why am I telling you this? You're in Missouri. But you know what? We have tornadoes. We have bad weather. We can have an earthquake, a very sizable one. You know, we can have other types of man-made disasters. And it all, the way people react pre-event, post-event, and during event, you can learn a lot from it. So we get it all done. We're sober, and we're waiting for the storm. We've got a plan. You know, our house is on the island. We had another Airbnb that we own that was 1 mile inland on another body of water, but it was 11 feet out of seawater. So we said, okay, if this thing's coming in as a Cat 1 or a Cat 2, we'll ride it out on the island. If it's a Cat 3 or better, we're going to fall back to that other house. If it's Cat 4 or Cat 5, we're going to fall back to my apartment, which is, I have an apartment that's 50 feet above sea level, and it's a concrete bunker of a building. So anyway, I'll tell you after this break what happened next. Sorry, y'all, my brain is not with it. I probably should have picked up on that cue that the show was starting a little sooner than I did. Again, I'm going to explain why my mind is not with it at the end of the show. So the storm's coming. We're in Florida. We've decided to ride it out of the island. We've got our plan to fall back to the inland house, 1 mile inshore on a creek. If things are above Cat 2, which essentially means, 100 mile an hour better. I think Cat 1 is like 60 to 70, which is essentially what we ended up getting. But so we, decided to stick it out. And then you start playing it hour by hour. You have to watch the storm. We don't have that luxury in Missouri with a tornado. They come at you fast. You don't know where they're going to go. You've got minutes, sometimes maybe an hour to plan. We have days down there, but yet you really don't know where it's going. You only have the spaghetti models or the cone of uncertainty, which, I saw a lot of fun memes. I live in the cone of uncertainty. Well, at this point, the cone of uncertainty was essentially everything from the Panhandle all the way to Naples. Tampa just happened to be right in the middle of the cone, and where the middle of the cone is where they think it's going the most, right? It's like these guys are betting on it, right? And so my wife and I are watching it hour by hour. I remember waking up at 4 a.m. to check the storm track to see, where it's going. And it had wobbled and started going to the east. And at that moment, it was becoming very apparent that it was going to hit land in the Cape Coral, Sanibel Island, Fort Myer, Punta Gorda, Venice, South Venice area. And that's exactly what it did, very slowly. At 5 miles an hour, it made its way to shore, just a hair under Cat 5 strength with winds at 150 miles an hour. Not sustained necessarily. And the one thing you got to know about those hurricane wind models, the Weather Channel is a bunch of fear-mongering cucks. Their entire job is to sell plywood, water, fuel, and basically Home Depot and Publix and whatever. Matter of fact, I even joked the couple days that we were getting ready for this hurricane, Jim Cantor, their number one hurricane chaser dude, and several of their other meteorologists showed up in Clearwater, which is just to my north by about, 2-3 miles. And so I thought, oh, that's not good. But then I kept telling myself, you know what? Clearwater is probably paying them to be there. Why not show up in Madeira Beach? Madeira Beach doesn't have the tourism budget that Clearwater does. So they go there and they talk about, look at these beautiful white sandy beaches. What a beautiful place to vacation that's about to get destroyed. And they're probably being paid to be there because that's what they do. They fearmonger. And when they talk about sustained wind speeds and hurricane categories, one thing I learned in this event was that the winds that they're measuring they're measuring those winds from a hurricane chasing airplanes, the planes that actually fly through the storm. These guys are nuts. And they measure the wind speed for the category decisions is measured at 10,000 feet, maybe 8,000. But obviously, it's going to be a lot windier at 10,000 feet than it is at sea level. So when they talk about 150 mile an hour winds, and then you see the reports, that the highest wind gusts that I think they saw in the Fort Myers area was like 132 or 134. It's because they're using that higher elevation number, again, as a way to fearmonger. They were saying that they were going to see 12 to 17 feet of surge. They ended up getting 7.26. 7.26 doesn't seem like a lot. 12 to 18, it seems very scary. But 7.26 was enough. It was enough to destroy a lot, and I'll get into that in a second. So anyway, the moral of the story here is the Weather Channel exaggerates, and they fearmonger, just like every other media on Earth about everything on Earth. And they always got to slide in their little digs about, oh, you know what, if it wasn't for those darn conservatives, we wouldn't have these hurricanes because, we wouldn't have global warming. Biden yesterday, climate change is real. At least we could all agree on that. You could see the blood draining out of DeSantis' face. By the way, I gained tremendous respect for DeSantis. He's amazing. Absolutely amazing. Probably my favorite politician ever in the history of ever. But, I'll go into that again later. So the storm starts turning towards them, moving really slow, hitting shore with 130 mile an hour winds. And the eye of the storm actually goes right into Port Charlotte and Fort Myers bays. They were very big areas of water, inland water, where rivers from Orlando basically feed into South Central Florida and into the Gulf. And this is a very big area. It's kind of hard to comprehend for somebody from Missouri, so let me put it in perspective. The storm was 450 miles wide. The eye of the storm was 40 miles wide. The eye is the most dangerous part, but yet destructive winds were 450 miles wide. So imagine a tornado 40 miles wide hitting Columbia, Missouri, and it's 450 miles of wind around that tornado. You're going to have damage in both Kansas City and St. Louis. If this hurricane hit Missouri and went across the state, it would have leveled St. Louis, Columbia, Jeff City, and Kansas City. That's the kind of size of area we're talking about. Actually, even more than that, if you include what the storm did after it went inland and what it did as it left the other coast. I'm not even counting that because that was like Category 1 BS. They got a lot of rain and some wind. But what happened down in Southwest Florida, I've seen it. I went down there. So let me get back to the story. So I see that the storm is turning, and I start counting my blessings. I'm like just a little bit thinking, oh, we might actually survive this. You know what I mean by financially, like the Tiger King said. I didn't plan on dying in the storm. You never know. But all of our family members were freaking out. My son was crying. My daughter was crying. My mother was crying. My sister-in-law was crying. My mother-in-law was crying. Everybody wanted us to run, but we had a plan. And I'll tell you more about that plan when we get back. Okay, so we're talking about the storm and my experience in it and what I learned about surviving the apocalypse from surviving the apocalypse. Okay, so the storm turns. It's headed in to this huge water area, a very, very boatable area of Southwest Florida. Also an area with a tremendous amount of people living in it. Millions and millions of people. So that one of their big fears about the hurricane hitting Tampa, which also would include St. Pete, Indian Rocks Beach, Clearwater, Largo, the list goes on and on, all the way down to Bradenton, all the way up to Tarpon Springs and Newport Richey. Again, area with millions and millions of people in it. I mean, Tampa alone is bigger than St. Louis. Okay, so you put you put St. Louis and Kansas City together, you might have a Tampa Bay area type population. All right, and that's very similar down south. It's just spread out over all those towns. and islands, Captiva Island, Sanibel Island, Fort Myer Beach, Fort Myer, North Fort Myer, South Fort Myer, Punta Gorda, Cape Coral, Venice, all of that. So this thing starts coming in, but it's moving in super slow motion, and it keeps ticking to the north. Just keeps ticking to the north, but it's just holding. The eye wall held on top of Sanibel Island. You could just see the backside of the eye wall on the island forever. And I thought, oh my God, those people, they're going to be dead. If anybody stayed on that island, they're not there anymore. The storm kept moving, just ticking north and ticking inward, but like just a click each time, just every hour, just a little bit more, just scrubbing that area. But still, I had tremendous fear and was ready to execute my plan because there was a couple spaghetti models that still showed this thing staying on its north track and coming right up through the backside of Tampa Bay, which would have put me on the hurricane eye between me and Tampa would have been devastating. So we were playing it by ear, hour by hour. And finally, at some point, I remember calling it, saying, okay, this thing's definitely headed to Orlando at this point. And we were able to relax. We had been spared. We had endured at our location, which was 70 miles from the eye of the storm. We had 70 to 75 mile an hour winds, 60 to 75 mile an hour winds for about 16 hours. 16 hours of 60 to 75 mile an hour winds. Fortunately, they were coming from the northeast, which saved my boat because the house actually blocked the boat. The house actually blocked the wind. I actually sat in my back and just listened to the wind roar through the houses, for hours and hours, praying for the people down south. And once it was over and the storm had moved by, my wife and I had made a decision to go help. We have a lot of friends. There's a ton of people from the St. Louis area that have vacation homes and or have moved to Clearwater, Punta Gorda, Cape Coral, and things like that. So we decided to load up our car with the thing that they needed the most, which was fuel, food, batteries, lights, and things like that. But basically fuel, food, water. So we went and bought a bunch of 5-gallon gas cans for $31 each at the local Ace Hardware with a big sign that says you cannot return anything bought during the hurricane, which I get it. But I still think they were price gouging on the gas cans. $31 for a 5-gallon can. It didn't have any gas in it. Anyway, so everybody down there, 2 million people, 2.1 million people had no electricity during the storm and after the storm. Matter of fact, we had friends that were riding it out down there. Those people didn't think it was coming their direction. Because they listened to the media, they listened to the Weather Channel, Tampa, Clearwater. They all didn't leave. They didn't do anything to protect their homes. They didn't board up anything. They didn't put out any sandbags. They didn't leave. Some of these idiots actually took their boats out thinking their boats would be safer with them driving it. Yeah, it didn't work out for those guys. So we knew what they needed. We were getting text messages from them during the storm. They were horrified. They had no news. They didn't know where the storm was, where the eye was. They just knew that it was on them. They didn't know how much longer they had. They didn't know if anybody around them was alive. And the only thing that would get out occasionally was text messages. Let's talk about that. During this weather crisis, communications, what we call comms in the business, were completely eliminated. There was no internet. There was no text messaging because the cell towers, guess what? Cell towers take electricity. Cell towers also get blown down. So without electricity, there's no cell towers. There's no 5G. There's no 3G. There's no 4G. The only thing you might be able to do is bounce a text message out that you send. It might go in a couple hours. And if somebody replies to you, it might come in a couple hours. But zero comms. No phones, no internets, no radios, nothing. You're absolutely in the dark. You're all alone. And if you stay in the zone after the evacuation order, you also don't get 911. No one is coming. It's up to you. You're all by yourself. Now, my wife and I knew this, and we faced that. They shut our island down. It was a mandatory evacuation order. We didn't leave. We got the passes to allow us to stay on the island. But honestly, to get from my house across the causeway to the other house is 1 mile. I figured I could make it. But these people didn't leave. They didn't do anything. And that storm came in, and it hit them. When we woke up that morning, I think it was Wednesday morning, we looked out behind our house. Now, remember, we were supposed to get 8 feet of storm surge. We looked out behind our house. The water was gone. The water was gone. You could walk across my bay, which is typically 6 feet of water. We had a negative 8 feet surge. We had a tidal negative 8. All of that water got sucked out of Tampa Bay, out of the Intercoastal Waterway, and it all got pushed around the storm and back slammed in to the south side of the storm. Negative 8 in Tampa Bay, plus 7.26 in Cape Coral, 7.26 in Fort Myers, 6 feet in Naples. So they have essentially a tidal wave of water that came in, over 7 feet of water came in along with 130 mile an hour winds. And here's the crappy part. Cape Coral is all below sea level and it's like canals. The whole town is built on a canal network where there's like water roads everywhere you go that lead out to the bay to get out to the Gulf. Every one of these houses that was built before the last 20 years, I would say, maybe the last 15, every one of those houses had at least 3 feet of water in it, 2 to 3 feet of water in it. So you have 130 mile an hour winds and 3 feet of water in your 1-story house. And it's just devastating. There's waves, there's current. There's no electricity current, but there's wave current. So we headed down to help them out. Normally it takes 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours to get from Tampa to Cape Coral. It took my wife and I 6.5 hours to get there. The major highway, Highway 75, was closed. That would be like shutting down 70 or 270. So we had to take side streets, what we call in the biz surface streets. Well, the surface streets are all of the sea level surface, so they were all underwater. It took us 6.5 hours to get there. And maps navigation, we actually had our phones working on the way down. The phones didn't stop working until we got to the actual epicenter, that 30 or 40 mile epicenter. But on the way down, we had navigation. We had Waze, we had Apple Maps, and we had Google Maps. And I must say, Apple Maps seems to be the one that had its stuff together the best. Waze didn't have a clue, kept running us into floods and closed roads. As we were driving down there, there's abandoned cars everywhere in the middle of the road, pointing the wrong way, from people that were trying to get out and abandon their cars in the storm. There's trees down everywhere, across every road. We actually waited a day to head down there because we knew we wouldn't get there without a chainsaw. I don't own a Jeep. So it takes us 6.5 hours to get there. We finally get there, and it was absolutely shocking. The amount of devastation and how far spread it was just unbelievable. Just people everywhere, shocked, in PTSD, horrified, shaking still. The people that wrote it out, every one of them saying they'll never do it again. And so what we did was we brought down what they needed, which was fuel, because the only people that had any electric is people that had generators. So that's the one thing I learned that I need that I don't have at my Florida homes, and I'm going to get one at my St. Louis house, is a generator. I also learned how to wire that generator right into the fuse panel. No matter what people tell you, it actually works if you do it right. And so the people that had generators have electric, but generators run on gas, right? The lines, there was no gas stations anywhere down there that was selling gas for days. After maybe day 3 or day 4, some gas stations opened up. In Florida, DeSantis requires gas stations to have generators so that they can pump gas. But if they don't have gas, there's no gas to pump. So on day 3 or 4, they started to get fuel. The lines to get gas, the lines of cars filled with gas cans to get gas for the generators were 5 miles long. 5 miles of cars, bumper to bumper, waiting to get into a gas station in order to fill 5-gallon gas cans. So the number one thing I learned was to make sure you have at least a week's worth of gasoline on hand to run your generator. Generator and a week's worth of gasoline. Of course, water, 1 gallon per person in your family per day for at least a week, right? So if there's 5 people in your family, that's 35 gallons of water that you need to have. And then you also need water to flush your toilets. Because without electric, the water don't run. There's no electric at the water pump station. So you have no water. And when the water does come back on, it's going to be a boil order. So one of the things my wife and I did before the hurricane, we filled our bathtubs with water. So you need 1 gallon of drinking water per person in your family times 7. But you also need to fill large containers, bathtubs, things like that with just regular water so you can have sewage, so you can actually flush your toilets. Obviously, the flashlights, the batteries, and the stuff like that. But the eye-opening stuff was the generators and the gasoline. Can you imagine having an electric car? Being one of these liberals that you have an electric car. How you going to charge that? You going to charge that with the generator, with the gas? No, you're not going anywhere in a disaster like this with an electric car. Gasoline was the commodity in Southwest Florida, and actually still is, although very quickly they got those pumps up and running. Very quickly they brought in more fuel. I do not have the faith in Missouri disaster response as I saw in Florida. It was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. They even built a freaking bridge in 3 days. Be back after this. All right, just wrapping up the story about my experience during Armageddon. And it really, for those people, it was definitely Armageddon. And it still is. Just because I left doesn't mean it isn't still a disaster. And they need help. There are tons of places you can donate to, but I recommend, what is it? Hold on. Before I recommend it, let me make sure I know exactly what it is. Don't give to the Red Cross or something stupid like that. It's actually a Florida site where the money actually goes right away to the right people. With that being said, I think it's FloridaDisasterRelief.org, FloridaDisasterRelief.org. But any way you can help, that would be a great thing. I did as much as I could while I was down there. I did tons and tons of manual labor for little old ladies that needed help recovering, moving their damaged stuff, cleaning up all the tree debris. We spent thousands and thousands of dollars hiring tree services for poor people and elderly that couldn't afford it. Felt good doing that. Yesterday, before I left, I was able to go to, I was actually one of the first people to set foot on Sanibel Island. Good friends of ours own a condo on Sanibel, and so they were able to get their pass, and the island opened up to owners. Yesterday morning, we were there at 8 a.m. We swam in from the beach, and it literally looks like the set of The Walking Dead, just without the zombies. That's what it looked like. The first floor of everything was gone. The second floor of most buildings was gone. I mean, you could literally see through the buildings. There was no proof of life. There was no, there's no furniture. There was no curtains. There was no carpet. There was no countertops. There was no appliances. Everything was gone out of every building's first floor. And all of that stuff was strewn in the trees and in the fields and in the parking lots. The parking lots were covered in 6 inches of sand. And then, various sundry appliances. And there was an air conditioning unit from a rooftop in the pool. Just nuts. And the creepiest thing about the island was the entire island was nothing. You could just hear the constant, incessant chirping of smoke detectors. every smoke detector on the island was going off. And it was just really eerie. It's going to take them years to rebuild Sanibel, Captiva, Pine Island, St. James. I'm sure Florida will dedicate tons of resources. They've got the bridge to Sanibel collapsed in 2 places. Now they got the bridge to Pine Island up in 3 days, which I'm amazed by. Literally, Florida FDOT came in like MoDOT and they built 3 bridges. I'm talking real bridges, like not military fold-out floating bridges. These are real bridges that they stood up. Now, the bridge to Sanibel is quite a bit different. It's a lot bigger project, but they already were on it when I was leaving, which was exactly 1 week from the storm. Now I want to talk about something that is on my mind heavily right now. And I probably shouldn't talk about it, but I almost killed myself on accident today. I almost killed myself on accident today. I've always said that there's no such thing as an unintentional discharge of a firearm, and that if you follow safety rules, you're never going to get hurt. I always said that it was negligent discharge only. There's no such thing as an unintentional discharge because only negligence allows a firearm to go off. Well, I had one of my guns go off today, and it went off pointed right at my head. It missed me by 3 or 4 inches, literally when I was getting ready to come to do this radio show. I'm still shaking. Let me tell you what happened. I know a lot of people are going to say I'm full of crap, but this is what happened. I decided to put my Rebel Arms Glock 19 in my waistband, in an inside the waistband holster, which is Kydex, provides some retention. It's a Glock 19, had it loaded up with Fort Scott TUI ammunition. And before I left to come to the radio station, I decided to go to the bathroom and pop a squat real quick. And as I squatted down on the toilet, and I pulled down my sweatpants, which are not really good to carry a gun, but this holster offers pretty good, it holds to the belt or to the pants really well. As I pulled down my pants, the gun flipped forward, which I've had happen so many times. The gun flipped forward, and the gun came out of the holster, headed towards the floor. This happened in a microsecond. As soon as I saw the gun headed towards the floor, I immediately flinched and winced back away from the barrel of the firearm, hoping that it wouldn't go off, and thinking to myself in that microsecond, it's a Glock, it can't go off. And it hit the floor, bang! And I saw a fireball in my face, and my ears rang, and I immediately thought to myself, I just killed myself. Where's the hole? I immediately started probing my face, my head, my neck, my chest, my body, my crotch, my groin, my legs, yelling for my son, stripping off my clothes, looking for blood. I had to be hit. There's no way I wasn't shot. And I knew I was dying, and it was all my fault. Somehow, by the grace of God only, the bullet passed my head by about 3 or 4 inches away and entered the wall directly behind the toilet. And I'm still here. Now, I'm pretty shaken up. I always have been a big believer in live by the sword, die by the sword. It's a biblical thing. And I always thought to myself, you know what? Shooting all these competitions, it increases my chances of losing my life to something like a negligent discharge. You're typically thinking of somebody else's, or maybe my own. And today, I almost died in my bathroom. My family would have thought I did it on purpose, although they knew that I would never do that. That's what I would have left behind, all because this Glock from this company, I guess, had a trigger job. I've never seen a Glock go off before when it hits the floor. We recreated it twice. It happened. And I'm going to be researching this gun and telling more about this story as I find out more. But be careful when you're carrying your gun in your pants like that.